Hey guys, Mr. Boothlier here. I thought that I would get with you really quickly before you got started on the first section of notes, just really quickly talk to you about where we're getting started this year. So as we think about the history of the Americas, it really starts in the age of discovery. Now you guys have had world history, so I'm not going to delve into a lot of the background, but suffice to say that human history has been around for thousands of years by the time we get to the age of discovery. And the age of discovery is the 1400s. And remember, this is kind of the result of the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the European nations during the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, this rebirth of learning that occurs during the end of the Middle Ages, where all sorts of new learning and discovery and inventions come to fruition. And then by the time we get to the 1400s, we're really starting to see the modern European nations arise. And one of those European nations is going to be Portugal. Now, Portugal plays a major role in the age of discovery, and it's largely because the brother of their king in the early 1400s, Prince Henry the Navigator, as he's known, sets up a school in Sagres in Portugal, and he starts taking all the new technology there, these new caravels, these new sailing ships, and there's the astrolabe and the compass, and there's all this new technology that's available, and he's training sailors to use this. And the Portuguese are amongst the first to go out into the open ocean and explore new areas. And of course, some of the first exploration the Portuguese are going to do is going to be around Africa. And the reason for that is because, well, for hundreds of years, Europeans have been trading with the Spice Islands of the East and Asia. But that's been cut off in the mid-1400s by the Ottoman Empire. This is a map showing the growth of the Ottoman Empire. By the time we get to the mid-1400s, the Ottoman Empire controls much of Southeastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and they cut off the trade routes. So because the trade routes are cut off, the Europeans still want their spices. They don't want to have to pay the Ottomans or deal with the Ottomans. So they start developing these new trade routes. And these new trade routes start by going around Africa. So you have people like Diaz and da Gama who use their knowledge in the new technology, and they travel around Africa, and they establish these courses. And sadly, part of that is going to be that they're going to get involved in the slave trade, which has existed in Africa and the Middle East and parts of Asia for thousands of years. But unfortunately, as the Europeans are getting around Africa, the Portuguese, beginning with the Portuguese, they get involved in the slave trade as well. And the book delves into that as well. But another person that's paying attention to all this new discovery is a young Genoese sailor, an Italian. And he's gone to Portugal and he's gone to Spain, and he's trying to get somebody to finance a voyage, because he says if the world is round, like most scholars thought at the time, then I can sail to the west and I can get to the Spice Islands of the east. Of course, Christopher Columbus ends up being successful doing that. The book goes into a lot of explanation of the first voyage. Of course, it's financed by the Spanish, Ferdinand and Isabella, the new king and queen of Spain. They have just united Spain, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. So really, it's the beginning of what we think of as modern Spain. One of the first things these monarchs do is they finance this voyage of Christopher Columbus. They give him 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And the book goes into some good explanation of the trip and the tension of the trip. And you know, they land in what we think is the Bahamas today, and some of the things that happen between them and the natives. It's quite an interesting tale. And of course, only 2 of the 3 ships come back. You see, the Santa Maria doesn't make it back. It ends up sinking in the New World. So there's a lot of complicated things that come from this. We know one, Christopher Columbus opens the door. There are some historians who talk about the Vikings. Yes, we know that the Vikings did spend some time in northerly parts of the New World, but nobody knew about it. They kept it secretive, and really the only way we know about that is archaeology, uncovering settlements in places like Newfoundland. But it's really Christopher Columbus that opens the door to the New World. The world will never be the same after the voyages of Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus's role is really critical. So you'll get in some pretty interesting details about what happens on that trip. Of course, you'll make 3 more trips after that. He actually ends up making 4 trips to the New World, but it's really the first one that he's most well known for. But there's a couple of things that come from this that are really important. Now, the book doesn't use this term, but you need to know this term, the Columbian exchange. This is going to be one of the things that completely changes the world. The plants, the animals, the ideas that are exchanged between the old world and the new world, which is the Americas. There are plants and animals that did not exist in each of those places that are brought to them. And so you think a lot of the plants, you know, like potatoes and tomatoes coming to the New World, things like wheat and oats, is the other way around. Tomatoes, potatoes going to the old world from the New World, and things like wheat and oats, etc., rice going to the New World from the old world. But maybe one of the most interesting things is the horse. The horse. There were no horses in the New World. There were no horses in the Americas. So when the Spaniards show up with the horses and they start exploring and they leave horses behind and the horses start to breed and proliferate, the Indians' culture is forever changed by the horse. It's hard to imagine the Plains Indians without horses, but know that horses were brought over after the voyages of Columbus. So everything will be changed. And a lot of times we think of the fact that because of this change, there are some negative things. And a lot of people like to really hammer Christopher Columbus about that. And the book gets into both sides of this issue. And I think this is really important to understand, something that we'll talk about later. It's called historiography. It's something that we look at a lot in the IB program, is that there are facts and then there are interpretations. And a lot of historians look at the facts and they interpret them differently. That's called historiography, right? So one of the things that will also develop is the triangular trade, the triangular slave trade. Slavery had existed in the world for thousands of years. And in fact, within Africa, Africans enslaved other Africans and then sold them into slavery, either eventually to the Europeans, but before that to the Arabs. So sadly, slavery had been around for a long time, but as the European development of the Americas progresses, it becomes part of a trading system. And slaves are brought over to the New World as part of that trading system. So that is going to be something that develops from this. Also, another thing that develops, not only the issue of slavery, and the book does a great job of looking at the moral issues around that, and some of the Catholic priests that really stand up for the slaves and the Native Americans. Very interesting discussions in the book. But also there's the issue of what happens to the Native Americans, right? Disease is the largest killer. A lot of times people think, well, you know, Christopher Columbus, terrible guy. But honestly, Christopher Columbus was a man who accomplished great things. And like all humans, he had some shortcomings. But the vast majority of Native Americans did not die because the Spaniards killed them or enslaved them, or later because they were persecuted. The vast majority of Native Americans died from diseases. And you have to remember, at that time, there was no germ theory. People didn't know that they may be immune to a disease, but they're carrying it. And if people who aren't immune to the disease are exposed to it, they may catch it and die from it. I mean, we're living through the COVID-19 pandemic right now. We understand these things fairly well today. We still have a lot to learn. And certainly in the 1400s, they didn't know nearly as much. So the vast majority of Native Americans die, sadly, because of disease, not because of the ruthless treatment of the Spaniards, even though the Spaniards are going to be pretty ruthless, and we will talk about that. So lastly, that's just a quick look at the first section. There's a lot of great detail in there as you read through that and as you answer the notes. But talking about the notes really quickly, let me run through my expectation of the notes. I will have you do Cornell notes for the next couple of years. Cornell notes, it's called Cornell notes because the guy, Walter Pock, who came up with the system was a professor at Cornell. And like me, he had a lot of great students who do great notes and then didn't do well on tests. And he said, how can I get my students to learn the information that they put into their notes. So he came up with a system that was designed to get students to actually repetitively be exposed to the material in their notes so they would actually remember what they took as notes. So key idea for Cornell Notes is you can split your paper up, right? So towards the left margin of the paper, you're going to make a line, and you're going to set that part aside. Then let's say the last 3 lines at the bottom, you're going to draw another line down there, set that aside. So on the left side of the paper, that's going to be for questions. At the bottom of each page, there'll be a section, 3 or 4 lines for a summary. But all of your notes are going to go in the center section. So let's talk about this really quickly, right? So you make sure you label each set of notes that you work on. Almost everything that you do for me is going to be in the center section, right? So I'm going to give you some questions. Those questions are going to be the backbone of your notes. You're going to write in outline format. You're going to answer my questions. That will form an outline of notes for you. When you're done with that, in the center section of the notes, you'll go through, highlight or underline the things that you think are most important. Then when you're done with that, you'll come over to that left column, and for each page, you'll write 2 or 3 questions that help you understand the notes better. Then at the bottom of each page, you're going to write a short 2 to 3 line summary of key ideas. So the whole idea here is to not just have you read the material, understand the material, or if you're listening to a lecture, take notes, but to expose you to the material several times, because we all know the more we're exposed to something, the more of it we'll remember. This is not even new. A lot of this is based on this guy's work, Hermann Ebbinghaus. He's a German scientist in the 1800s. How do we get people to remember better? And he starts doing this work on memory, and he finds out that there's something that's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, that when people are exposed to something, they got it. But then they slowly start forgetting it. And over a period of time, they forget it more and more. Then after a period of time, they don't remember much of it all. But what he also found out was that when people are repetitively exposed to information, they forget less and less, and they remember more and more. So with each repetition of the information, you remember more. That's the key idea of Cornell Notes, is that you take the notes, then you go back and you highlight or underline, then you question, then you summarize, then you got these great notes that you can maybe just flip through for 5 minutes and look at a later date. So you repetitively expose yourself to the information, and it helps you remember the information. You've taken the time to take good notes. You want to remember the information. So that's the key with Cornell Notes. I don't expect your Cornell Notes to be perfect. I will take these up in August. I want you to do these on paper, and I won't take them up till school starts. But I don't expect them to be perfect, but I expect you to try to do them well. Here's a couple of examples. Here's one that's not incredibly neat, but the person has the right idea, right? They are answering the questions. They're setting the questions up based on the outline that I've given and answering them, highlighting key ideas. Then they even over here with their questions, they wrote a little bit more and they came up with a summary. Here's one a little bit more organized. Where this person wrote the questions that I gave them, then they answered the questions, then they used a method of highlighting the key ideas, they came up with questions, and they wrote a summary. That's basically the idea of Cornell Notes. Repetitive exposure to information helps us remember it better. So this is going to be the first section notes. They should be on what you read last week. These will be due technically next Monday, but I won't take up the notes until we get back to school in August. But next week, we'll start the next section of the reading. So take your time this week, dig through these notes, try to do them well. Try to get the idea of the Cornell Notes correct. You can look back through this, or there's plenty of information on Cornell Notes on the web. Everybody does them a little bit differently. This is how I do them. Try to do them the best that you can. And like I said, this first time, I'm not going to hammer you on them. My hope is that we'll get better with them as we go along.